I still remember the moment my dad looked at me across the kitchen table, his face a map of lines etched by disappointment, and said, "You've done nothing for us." I was 25 then. Newly graduated from a modest state university with a degree in environmental design and a fierce determination to prove my worth. My mother sat beside him, silent and pale, her hands twisting in her lap. The midday sun filtered through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the worn tabletop. I felt an awkward hush settle over us, heavier than any words they could have spoken. I'd flown back home to Cedar Ridge, a small lakeside town in northern Michigan, for my dad's 57th birthday. He'd been a high school shop teacher for 30 years, building cabinets and mentoring kids who never had much hope of college. My mom managed the town's only bakery, waking before dawn to knead dough and frost pastries by the time the students came through the door. They'd poured their lives into this place for as long as I could remember, and I'd begged them for the freedom to chase a career elsewhere. I thought they'd be proud when I landed a freelance design contract in Chicago, even if it paid little at first. Instead, their eyes followed every dollar I had left. I left Chicago behind when I realized that the city's skyline didn't spark joy in me the way the pines by our cabin did. So I sublet my studio apartment and came home. I planned to launch my own design studio, focusing on sustainable cabins that blended into their natural surroundings. But the thought of pitching to faceless investors in a metropolis exhausted me. Yet when I unpacked my boxes in my old bedroom now painted a calming sage green, I felt the stirrings of possibilities. I sketched floor plans late into the night, listening to loons call across the lake, imagining cabins powered by solar panels and heated by wood stoves. My parents didn't buy it. They said I was chasing a dream with no guarantee of payment. When I told them I wanted to purchase the old family cabin on the lakefront long neglected, its siding peeling and windows cracked, they laughed. My dad's words cut deeper then. He realized, "You've done nothing for us," he said, folding his arms as if to seal me out. I swallowed hard, my cheeks burning. I wanted to defend myself, to list my successes, my scholarship, my clients, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded and went to my room. That night I lay awake, wondering how I could answer that accusation. I remembered every internship, where I'd stayed late to draft plans, every client who'd praised my work ethic, every late-night phone call with a professor offering guidance. I also remembered the promise I'd made to myself when I first saw that cabin, to restore it as a gift from my parents. It was built by my grandfather in the 1970s, his first project after returning from Vietnam, and it had once been the heart of our family's summers. I wanted to bring it back to life, to give them a space where they could finally relax and see the fruit of my labor. Over the next few weeks, I consulted builders, landscapers, and renewable energy experts. I negotiated prices, studied zoning laws, and secured the necessary permits. I tapped into my savings and took out a small loan against the modest equity in my condo in Chicago, confident that once the cabin was renovated, I could rent it seasonally and cover the costs. I sketched new blueprints that preserved the original pine beams and stone fireplace, while adding large windows to frame the lake view and a green roof to reduce runoff. I emailed renderings to contractors in town and flew back home to meet them in person. I kept my plans secret from my parents. I met with Tom, the local carpenter who had built birdhouses with my dad when I was a girl, and together we mapped out the demolition of the peeling clapboards. I hired Lily, a recent engineering grad, to design the solar array that would power the cabin. I ordered reclaimed wood for the floors and eco-friendly insulation that had become my specialty. I spent late nights at the kitchen table, spreading invoices and plans around me like a puzzle. I didn't feel resentful. I felt alive, fueled by the idea that I could prove my dad wrong, not with words but with action. When construction began, I visited the site every morning at 6, wearing a hard hat and work boots, carrying a thermos of strong coffee. The early light danced across the mist rising from the lake, and I felt a quiet pride in the hum of saws and the scent of fresh cedar. Neighbors waved from passing cars as they took their fishing gear down to the water. I introduced myself to the electrician, the plumber, the roofer, each one a professional I'd recruited with a promise of timely payment. I tracked the schedule closely, adjusting deadlines and ordering materials just in time. I operated like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of TRADESPOPLE. By the end of the first month, The cabin stood framed and naked against the verdant backdrop. The old windows had been replaced with floor-to-ceiling panes that reflected the pines. The foundation, once cracked and sagging, had been reinforced with new stonework. I watched as Lily tightened the bolts on the solar panels, her face illuminated by satisfaction. I felt a knot loosen in my chest. I was doing something significant, something real. I was creating value where there had been decay. I still hadn't told my parents. I carried the secret like a hidden talisman, knowing that unveiling it would be my moment of truth. I pictured their faces when they drove down the dirt road, saw the freshly stained cedar, and stepped onto the wraparound porch. With its view of the glassy lake, I imagined my father's astonishment, his pride that he might finally acknowledge the work I'd poured into every plank and beam. I knew that the real payoff wouldn't be the rental income or the restored property, it would be their belief in me, their acceptance that I had, after all, done something for them. We arrived at dawn on Saturday morning and turned off the paved road onto the narrow gravel drive that led to the cabin by the lake. My heart pounded as I parked the old SUV under the towering pines. Dad and Mom sat silently beside me there, faces unreadable, but I could feel their tension rising like the steam from my coffee. I clutched a bouquet of daisies in one hand and in the other a note folded into thirds. I stepped out and motioned toward the cabin. It had been nearly restored by summer light and fresh paint, but none of that mattered until Dad and Mom saw it unfold before them. I waited breathless as they left the car and followed me across the dewy grass toward the honey-colored cedar siding and the roof that gleamed under the morning sun. This was my moment of truth. Mom was the first to react. She paused on the porch, running her fingers along the newly sanded railing. I saw her chest rise and fall as though she held her breath. Dad stood behind her, arms crossed and jaw clenched. He looked at the cedar boards and then up at me, but said nothing. The morning air felt heavy, charged with anticipation. I led them onto the wide porch where a pair of Adirondack chairs waited facing the glass panes of the cabin's great room. We stepped inside simultaneously and gasped. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the lake like a living painting. Sunlight poured through the panes, illuminating oak floors built from reclaimed beams. Dad's eyes widened and Mom covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. They exchanged a look of wonder and disbelief. I felt a warmth spread through me like sunrise breaking through clouds. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the folded note and held it out. My mother glanced at it, then at me. She nodded and unfolded the paper. Her cheeks flushed as she read the words, "Thank you for believing in me." I pointed to the built-in cabinets, the custom butcher block island, and the stainless fixtures. Dad ran a hand over the dovetail joints, inspecting each seam. He turned to me, eyes shining with pride, and said softly, "You did this, Mom." Set the daisies in a vase on the foyer table. Then I led them outside where Lily was finishing the installation of solar panels. Dad crouched beside her, examining the bolts and wiring. He asked questions. Lily answered with confidence. I watched them trade respect in each nod. Every connection felt like a bridge spanning the gulf that had existed between us for years until now. Inside the cabin, the fireplace stood framed by new stonework. Dad ran a hand along the smooth hearth and sighed. I watched him settle into one of the chairs across from me. Mom draped a cozy wool blanket over my shoulders. "It's warm," I said, gesturing at the glow of the underfloor heating system. She smiled and touched my arm. "You thought of everything," she murmured. The touch of her hand grounded me. Dad leaned forward, studying the vintage light fixture suspended above the kitchen island. A single bulb hung behind a repurposed mason jar shade. "This is beautiful," he said and reached for my hand. "You have an eye for design." I swallowed the lump in my throat and smiled at him. His approval tasted sweeter than any praise I had ever heard, and I knew it would carry me forward long after the build was complete. More than bricks or beams could ever hope to withstand. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the pines and danced on the lake in the distance. We shared coffee and laughter, telling stories of past summers, when we were a family unbroken by distance or hurt. Dad smiled and said, "I owe you an apology." My throat tightened as he continued. "I judged you unfairly. I thought you had turned away from us, but you were building a bridge instead." Tears pricked my eyes, not tears of sadness, but of relief and grace. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We never doubted your love for us," she said, voice thick. "This cabin proves you have always carried us in your heart." The evening breeze rustled the pine needles around us and I felt the past settle into place. A new chapter of my life was beginning, rooted in reconciliation and renewal. I stood and led my parents back outside where the lake shimmered inviting beneath a cotton candy sky. Dad picked up one of the oars leaning against the boathouse wall. He ran his fingers along the smooth shaft and handed it to me. "Take us out," he said, steady and calm. I lifted the oar and grinned at him. Mom laughed and clapped as I helped her into the rowboat. Dad followed and together we drifted onto the mirror surface of the water. I let the oars rest and breathed in the scent of pine and summer breeze. "This is perfect, Mom," said, leaning her head on my shoulder. Dad closed his eyes and nodded in agreement. In that moment I felt the weight of my father's words lift as though carried away by the breeze. Our laughter mingled with the lapping of water and the call of loons. By the time the sun peeked over the treetops the next morning, I was already on the porch, sketchbook in hand. I traced the curve of the lake's far shore and imagined a small dock extending into the water. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the only sound was my pencil scratching paper. In those moments before anyone else woke, I realized the cabin had become more than a gift, it was my purpose manifest. I was no longer chasing someone else's vision of success but following the blueprint I drafted. In solitude, guided by the rhythms of nature and the lessons my parents had taught me, when I finally called Dad in for breakfast, he bounded down the path with a thermos of coffee and 2 mugs. We sat at the bistro set on the porch, steam curling between us as mist drifted off the lake. He traced the outline of my dock drawing with a thoughtful finger and asked, "What's next?" I hesitated only a moment before sharing my plan: to host weekend design workshops here in the off-season, teaching the principles of sustainable building and renewable energy to aspiring architects and homeowners. His brow furrowed, then relaxed into a proud smile. "That's brilliant," he said, lifting his mug in a quiet toast. Over the next few weeks, I posted flyers in town and sent emails to my old university professors. Soon a small group signed up to recent grads, a high school teacher interested in community outreach, and a retired couple who dreamed of converting their summer home into an eco-retreat. I organized the lodge's now cozy dining area for presentations and laid out sample materials on a folding table by the fireplace. Every evening, I tested recipes with Mom's flour. She insisted on homemade cinnamon rolls and refined my slide deck by the glow of the lantern. I watched my vision take shape. Just as I had the cabin itself, the first workshop dawned chilly but bright. I led the group through a tour of the cabin, pointing out the thick wool insulation, the passive solar gains from the south-facing windows, and the rainwater collection barrels hidden behind a cedar screen. The participants asked sharp, enthusiastic questions that reminded me of my own early curiosity. I demonstrated how to calculate heat loss, showed them how to seal drafts, and invited them to help plant a small garden to shade the cabin's western wall. By lunchtime, the rookie architect was sketching her own version of the dock, and the teacher was planning a school project to build birdhouses from leftover cedar siding. Each day brought new challenges and rewards. One afternoon, the retired couple discovered a nest of raccoon kits under the boathouse stairs. We carefully cordoned off the area, documented their behavior, and installed a secure hatch to prevent future surprises. Another morning, a sudden rainstorm flooded part of the driveway. I organized a chain of volunteers to lay gravel and improve drainage, turning what could have been a setback into a hands-on lesson about site planning. With every obstacle, I felt the cabin and community growing stronger, and I realized that this was the real value I offered: leadership born from empathy and expertise. By late October, the workshops had drawn the attention of a regional magazine. A reporter spent 2 days filming the cabin in golden afternoon light, capturing interviews with participants and my parents. When the article and video went live, inquiries poured in from as far as Georgia and Pennsylvania. Booking requests for winter retreats arrived, and local builders asked if they could subcontract eco-friendly upgrades through my fledgling studio. I stood in the newly cleared lot beside the cabin, watching construction vehicles arrive to begin the next phase, and felt a surge of gratitude that pulsed through every beam I'd installed. One crisp evening, as the workshops wound down and the last guest packed her car, I sat by the fireplace with Mom and Dad. The first wood fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and the scent of pine smoke. Dad lifted his mug of hot cider and said, I was wrong to doubt you." His eyes shone with both apology and pride. Mom reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "You didn't just do something for us, you've inspired everyone around you." Tears welled in my eyes, but I smiled through them, because their words weren't just praise, they were the foundation on which I would build everything that followed. As winter settled in, the cabin became a haven of light and warmth against the gathering snow. Strings of lanterns lit the pathways, and the workshops continued, focusing now on winterproofing, fiber optic lighting, and firewood management. I led snowshoe hikes to survey natural insulation opportunities, demonstrated how to harvest birch bark sustainably, and hosted evening gatherings where stories were shared over steaming mugs of cocoa. The laughter echoing through the pines reminded me of childhood summers, but this time I stood as the guide, confident in my role and proud of the home we'd all brought to life. One morning in February, I received a call from a producer scouting locations for a documentary on sustainable living. She had seen our magazine feature and wanted the cabin to be a central location. After I confirmed the dates and logistics, I sat back and breathed deeply. It felt surreal to think that just a year earlier, my parents had believed I'd done nothing for our family. Now the cabin and the vision it embodied was making waves far beyond Cedar Ridge, inspiring people to rethink how they build, live, and connect with the world around them. Standing on the porch that evening, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, turning the sky to shades of pink and lavender. I could see the first footprints in the fresh snow leading to the dock, and know they'd soon be joined by many more. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the wool blanket warm against my skin, and thought of the journey here, the tension of that kitchen table confrontation, the silent determination that drove me through sleepless nights, and the quiet pride in every board I nailed in place. My parents' faith had been the spark, but this cabin, this home, was proof that dreams built with care can change lives, starting with your own.